It is an ancient impulse in man to invoke a divine sanction for his customs and institutions, and even for his greater crimes. Folly itself seems to be sanctified if it is deeply enough seated in the world. Herodotus represents the Trojan and Persian wars as earthly manifestations of an eternal quarrel between the goddess Europa and the goddess Asia. Similarly, President Wilson referred the late war, after he became entangled in it, to a divine epic necessity destined to surpass all war and to make the world safe for democracy. Others, whose home myths were different, nerved themselves to the same struggle by fancying that they were once again defending Latin genius and religion against the assaults of barbarism. Or, what is the same thing turned round, that they were stepping forth proudly and resolutely to perform a crowning act in a providential drama, in which dominion perpetually passes from old or dissolute nations to nations that are young or ruthlessly organized. This bombast is no accident. It represents the essential difference between people who follow custom or passion instinctively and those who attribute to them a superior authority and follow them deliberately. It would be nothing that any party or nation should be animated by the will to dominate. Every child and every criminal is so animated. The point is that the party or nation should invoke the authority of universal nature or of some glorious destiny to sanctify its private impulse. It then makes a virtue of its passion, or perhaps of its madness, and identifies morality with a steady determination to suppress all impulses save those in harmony with itself. Harmony is indeed, as Socrates taught, the principle of morality, as well as of beauty. It is what in modern language we call organization. But for exclusion, assimilation, and definite heredity, there would be no life. And the high points of civilization and intelligence are reached when the greatest resources are gathered up and dominated by some one nucleus or order, by some definite traditional body. On the other hand, the celestial machinery invented to account for this fact is needless and fabulous. Events, unless my philosophy is sadly mistaken, have diffuse causes in the jumble of previous events, and the sequel stultifies all prophecies and romantic logics, even when in some verbal sense it may seem to fulfill them. Thus, geographically, there is still a Europe and an Asia, and we are told to expect terrible conflicts between them, as if they were a brace of fighting cocks. But what are the corresponding moral entities, and where do they begin or end? Modern Europe and America are what a Greek would have called Asiatic in scale, organization, luxury, and religion, while Muslim Asia is at least as much an heir to Hellenism in ways of living and feeling as the West is in letters, and as to externals the Chinese and the Turks may soon be indistinguishable from Yankees. The continents of Herodotus remain, but both his goddesses have perished. The same fatuity appears in the myths of our own day. Events have curiously belied the idealisms by which they were supposed to be explained or sanctioned. The manifest destiny pursued by Imperial Germany with such extraordinary resource and conviction has ended in smoke. There is not only a momentary pause due to circumstances, but a moral change of front. This change of front was indeed announced by Spengler, an authorized herald of German myths, when he still expected a military victory. Germany would guide the world, but henceforth only in the paths of material greatness. no other leadership of greatness being possible in the coming age. Germany would thus do for the vast herds of mankind rather less than Napoleon might have done for them, and a little more than America is actually doing. For if there is to be a domination of the world by mechanism, it is not now to Germany that the domination is likely to fall. Inventions are soon generalized, while the manpower and the natural resources lie rather in China and India, in Russia and the United States. Nor is it clear that the major premise of the Spenglerian prophecy is sound, and that the earth is about to be subjected to homogeneous mechanical regimen without national or local characters. Perhaps various peoples like the Japanese may adopt the requisite mechanical equipment only the better to defend their moral diversity. The special form and spirit thus preserved in certain centers would then be likely to spread over the comparatively amorphous parts of the surrounding world, as the Greek form and spirit spread, diluted over the east with Alexander and over the west with Rome. In the same way, the maxims of the French Revolution and the English parliamentary system have spread over the modern world. But where not native to the soil, they have proved absurd excrescencies without use or vitality. It would have been simpler and healthier if each nation or city had bred its own traditions and had remained faithful to them. This conviction is now deeply felt and loudly expressed in many parts of the world, in Asia, in America, in Italy, in Spain, in Poland, and Ireland. Perhaps the epidemic of catchwords by which international democracies are swayed may not avail to obliterate the natural constitution of society in different classes and in different places. There must always be a Germany, as there must always be a Spain. But it would seem as if the Germany of yesterday, like the Spain of the 16th century, could never be restored. The clock has run down and the key is lost, and if we turn to the other camp, where is the victory that was to ensure universal peace and democracy? We find everywhere disgust and confusion and ominous rumblings, plutocracy uneasy, parliaments discredited, governments impotent, and if a note of youth or hope is sounded anywhere, it comes from the national autocracies set up in several states, notably in Italy and Spain, where the incubus of a foreign liberalism, hypocritical even where it is native, has been thrown off, and the true interests of mankind have begun to appear in their ancient simplicity: order, friendship, beauty, union. But the chief, the unexpected, and tremendous byproduct of those vain convulsions has been the union of socialist Soviet republics. This too is an autocracy, but not national. It avoids using the name of Russia and aspires to be universal. Here is an armed aesthetical sect with doctrine proclaiming its right and its intention to govern the whole world. Here crime, or not to mention rivers of blood, it is crime to trample on living interests, material and moral, at one's sweet will. Here, too, crime appeals to mythical sanctions. The courage of the faithful in their own sufferings and perplexities is fortified by a thundering philosophy which assures them that fate is on their side and that their speedy triumph is certain. It would be easy to mock this prophecy and to proclaim in one's turn that these promises will fail or have failed already, if by success we understand the realization of the bright ideal conceived in the beginning. But the delusions of this kind are elastic. The original sense is soon lost in some new meaning, which necessity or a changed imagination may presently read into them. There is therefore no knowing, even after the fact, whether they have failed or succeeded. Did the Roman Empire succeed, or Christianity, or Islam, or Protestantism, or liberalism? Such movements have a momentum which may long be traceable materially, after they are spiritually extinct. They may have served to gain a new form or equilibrium to human customs and sentiments, and dissolving and merging with other influences they may initiate a new civilization. The Bolshevist system, like the fascist, is intolerant. It intends to impose a regimen, a task, and a mode of sentiment on everybody within its fold. In other words, its ambition is to occupy the heart and to guide life from within in all its manifestations, instead of merely controlling it at its periphery, as if the state were a menagerie of miscellaneous creatures that needed only a local or an international police to keep them from biting one another. Intolerance in the 19th century had a bad name and seemed identical with tyranny, but intolerance is an integral part of form, a biological principle of health. If you are anything, you cannot be or consent to become anything contrary to your essence. As the body rejects poisons, so a community, if it has moral definition, must reject treason or dissidence or disaffection. It has no place for the essential alien, not because the alien need be wicked or mistaken or inferior, but because he is foreign here, incompatible with this experiment and out of this picture. All societies are intolerant insofar as they are morally definite. A liberal regimen can leave everything important free only because it leaves everything important out. Under a liberal regimen, the middle and upper classes could live very safely and comfortably and could freely improve their minds. Unless a man took up politics as a sport or a hobby, he could forget that there was a government at all, except at intervals when there was much shouting because the persons of the government were being changed, and after they were changed he observed no difference. Property was safe, taxes were fixed and moderate, or else indirect and invisible. Custom and law, which were ferociously intolerant, provided for his personal security. Being providentially endowed with a religion, a home, and income, or easily able to acquire them of his own initiative, he only asked not to be pestered by meddlesome priests, policemen, tax gatherers, or recruiting sergeants. There existed convenient churches, universities, railways, and steamships, luckily all privately endowed and privately managed for his education and travels. Academies and international impresarios amply provided for his tastes, and fashionable society for his pleasures. The fields were still green, open for walking or even for hunting, and it was pleasant afterwards to sit by the fire and read of the discoveries of science or the curious speculations of philosophers. And then, after a hearty dinner, tucked deliciously in bed, it was easy to fall asleep between smiles and tears over some great sentimental novel. Naturally, in this liberal paradise, the mere idea of intolerance seemed hideous and intolerable. What possible right could anyone have to interfere with this happiness or to encroach on this liberty? Unfortunately, the world is in flux, and the prosperous, whatever may be their prosperity, are like little wanton boys that swim on bladders, but far beyond their depth. Those periodical rows, when the government was being changed, were continually loosening the moral fabric of society. Each election, with its factious hatreds and false promises on every side, was a lesson in disaffection. Meantime, the growth of industry and our population was undermining the social fabric materially. The many who had no home, or a hateful one, no education, no income, and no religion, somehow did not find felicity in naked freedom. A man to whom nothing belongs wishes at least to belong to something. He will be glad of a vote as an acknowledgment of his rights and a testimony of equality, or as a weapon to be used vindictively, to destroy everything which he does not possess, and the state itself will seem to him the chief of his natural enemies until it becomes socialistic and begins to provide for his personal needs. Meantime, his free church or club or trades union will be the sole objects of his loyalty. These societies, at first nominally voluntary, become inevitable for him and compulsory. He must live by one or another of them, or he can have no life. They are the nuclei of a new regimen and of a new intolerance, despotic to those within and merciless to those outside. The more completely these new organisms absorb the allegiance of their members, the more anarchical the old national state becomes, with its disastrous elections and its weak governments, and more superfluous. its only function seems to be to create frontiers, maintain armies, and produce wars. Yet since geographical and economic necessity compels the inhabitants of any region to acknowledge some common authority, there will be no choice in the end but to organize the free societies in which people actually live, industrially and morally, into a single compulsory society. The state will then be a union of social soviets. Such is the character of the new autocracies, no less in Italy and Spain than in Russia. Indeed, Italy and Spain realize this ideal better, because the misfortune of Russia is that its revolution has been made by outcasts and doctrinaires in the interest of a class war and of the dictatorship of the proletariat, so that its doctrine includes a chimerical philosophy of history that expects events to move dialectically, and an absurd theory of value that measures value by hours of labor and not by the excellence of the result, while its practice disregards or suppresses half the spontaneous associations, such as the church and the nation itself, which required to be included in a fair political synthesis. It is precisely these living Soviets, carrying the moral interests and traditions of mankind with them, that the new governments of Italy and Spain are embodying in their constitutions, because the men who guide them, though resolute, are not fanatics but large-hearted and rich in human experience. That a particular religion, nationality, or military organism should exist anywhere is a historical accident, as are all the specific traditions of mankind at any particular stage. But these accidents are the very substance of politics, which a just and truly representative government exists to harmonize, not to destroy. It would be a pity to suppress in human nature or in tradition precisely the most human and most civilized elements, in order to begin again at the bottom with a pack of animals. It is not enough to antagonize wanton invaders or heresies precisely for threatening and not being able to share one's traditional life. Why turn ferociously against one's own bosom and try to extirpate there our home passions and profound inheritance? The intolerance of revolutionaries is not only more sweeping than that of conservatives, but less excusable. Not that there is anything sacred or even reasonable in things as they are. Almost always things as they are absurd and odious, and there would be little harm in destroying them root and branch, if such violence merely hastened their disappearance, which, although many a fond soul may regret it, is always inevitable in the end. The great evil of destruction is perspective. Not what revolutionaries destroy condemns them, but what they produce. For what they produce is simply ruin. True beginnings do not come from revolution, but from unintended and unnoticed seeds, falling in the fallow field, or perhaps in the furrow, ploughed with some other intention. But for such happy accidents, revolution would produce nothing. It merely rendered difficult the continuance or genesis of different organisms, whether better or worse than those which it had destroyed, since there is nothing more obdurately stable than a desert, or less fertile than moving sands. Intolerance flows from moral integrity, far from being a vice. It is consequence of health and vigor, the thermometer of virtue. Yet, except in rare instances where harmony is spontaneous, this virtue must have a sinister side. It must be the unflinching enemy of much that flourishes outside, and of much that might flourish within. Sacrifice is inevitable, because in a living synthesis each person or each passion has a head of its own, and is not adjusted a priori to any eventual harmony. To forbid, to demand, to lead, to modulate, in a word, to govern, is therefore inevitable, if anything definite is to be achieved or maintained. Such is the price of order, of greatness, of virtue, of life itself. The cruel character of existence, with the insecurity and imperfection of its best achievement, may tempt the philosopher to turn away from life altogether, or to aspire to live only in the spirit, repenting, as it were, of all those shameful limitations and injustices which are imposed upon him by time and place, by his human nature, and his tribal morality. Nature, however, cannot repent. Every child in every nation is born unregenerate, in spite of all sour prophets or shining redeemers. Until destruction overtakes this world, it must live on its own terms, succeeding here and there through intolerance and victory, establishing for a time some modicum of harmony, because of its special regimen were imposed anywhere, but all were toleration and freedom, chaos and non-entity would have already returned. It is unreasonable, therefore, to blame intolerant governments or moralities for those constraints which are proper to organic existence. But we may note certain limits beyond which moral integration is impossible, so that the effort to attain it becomes a vain violence. Virtue, as a man may possess it, whether in the soul or in the state, is the synthesis of impulses which are initially independent, and this tremulous organization is faced in nature at large by overwhelmingly greater forces, which are alien and indifferent. Virtue may accordingly overreach itself in two directions: at home by exacting perfection, abroad by claiming universality. In either case, its constitutional intolerance becomes a trespass, aggressive, not conservative, arbitrary instead of natural, malignant rather than holy. These trespasses of virtue are the cause of the bad name which intolerance has had in the modern world. For no one notices his own intolerance, which in himself or his party everyone calls high principle or zeal for progress, and in the looseness of his own ideas and traditions he would find oppressive almost any definite regimen that could be proposed to him, having no natural roots in his own soul. St. Francis could preach persuasively to the birds and fishes because he understood their relation to God and God's relation to them. If he had bidden them learn to sing the Latin Psalter or come and be fried in the kitchen, they would have pecked his eyes out or bitten his shins. If we wish to hold any reasonable communion with alien natures, we must rise to the point of view of God, our common Creator, who is not a moralist. We may then, in our affectionate detachment, see the humor and sweetness of our comradeship and the necessity of our conflicts, and even in these we shall understand both sides with a religious chivalry, and be brave without being angry. Such was the spirit of the classic poets in describing battles among the gods, or even among men. They saw the glorious vanity of it all, and how nature is but a confused and painful Olympia. But the manliness of their souls kept them from slipping even for a moment into disloyalty to their own side. Better perish bravely than suffer change, which would be but a slower way of perishing, and less honorable, and their readiness to die, far from weakening their determination to live beautifully, kept the beauty of their lives inviolate. Here was morality in its place, and unyielding integrity without arrogance or unreason. If some sentimental sparrow had chirped in St. Francis's ear, that he might just as well stop chanting and psalter and choir, because the woods were God's first temples, and music was pure without words, the saint would most assuredly have wrung that silly bird's neck. And if some blustering whale had replied to his sermon by bellowing that men too were mortal like whales, and that there was no pure spirit in them, and no heaven for them, the apostle of charity would instantly have perceived that the devil had taken possession of this whale, and with a violent exorcism would have driven the fiend out of that innocent monster, and sent it, freed from the errors of thought, to spout the white sea spray with a vengeance. A sense of brotherhood with all forms of existence, however strange, whether it comes through spiritual insight or through an initial sympathy, such as in the joy which children take in animals, implies security in one's own being. The child does not yield an inch of his own ground out of consideration to his pet's wishes, nor is a clear spirit tempted to forego its intellectual dominion and whoop with the savages or burrow with the worm. On the contrary, what chills this natural sympathy and suggests the prosperous desire to impose human morality on nature or human logic on God is the sense of insecurity in oneself. Terror does not create the gods, but it creates the mania to humanize them, and the same terror creates the passion for regimenting other men and compelling them to think and to act as we do. A truly lordly spirit, or a truly humble one, perfectly content and sure of itself, would love to be surrounded by giants and dwarfs, persons of all nations and moralities. Without contaminating one's own soul, they enlarge its field and add to the gaiety of nature. But unfortunately, it is seldom given to an incarnate spirit to be safe. Its food and air, if not its inner resolution, are always being filched away from it or poisoned. Nature is overcrowded with seeds. You must trample on others to make room for yourself. This is the reason why on earth there is a recurrent ambition to establish universal empires, religions, or systems of thought. Terror, the uneasiness at being oneself, are at the base of it. As nowadays we all dress alike, because each of us is ashamed of his looks. Uniformity is a refuge from nullity. No brave and spontaneous organism would put forth such a claim, but a dreadful consciousness of weakness and inferiority drives us to abolish all differences and to hide our ugliness and bolster up our illusions by imposing them on other people. What comes of the same thing by adopting theirs. This is why religions and political parties carry on propaganda, why women want votes, why uneasy minds dream of a universal language or government or philosophy. The field of human affairs being now grown narrow, so that every race and every mind, to its confusion and destruction, is intertwined with all others. No organization promises to be staunch unless it is universal, but such need of universality, where it is real, as perhaps in commerce, is a geographical accident. There will be no speculative insight in a philosopher who wished to extend human logic to the universe or human morality to God. God, as the true sages tell us, is great, and nature, even if not great in the same sense, nor raised above particularity, escapes any given particularity by continually changing it for another, and the finite mind, too, may escape through irony from the limitations which it cannot escape through omniscience.